Hello, welcome. I'm Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to encourage everyone to submit their questions for the speaker using the Slido link that is provided in the chat. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We will address them after the speaker's remarks. Thank you. Today, we're speaking with Karen Bakker, this year's Martina S. Horner Distinguished Visiting Professor. She is an environmental geographer with a particular interest in environmental governance. Karen describes her work as often starting from the insight that environmental processes and social practices are mutually shaped by each other. While her overarching research theme is best described as socio-ecological justice, she is a consummate interdisciplinary worker. Her publications have included research findings from social sciences and natural sciences, and her collaborations have led her to work with experts in an even wider array of fields well before her time at Radcliffe. Karen's most extensive publications to date have focused on the critical role of water and water governance in the life of communities. Most recently, she has expanded her focus to study the function and effectiveness of digital technology in the ecological field. Her book, The Sounds of Life, published in 2022, assembles an array of research to examine how digital technology has been used to expand collective knowledge of non-human sounds and communication. In addition, she discusses the potential of this research to shape environmental conservation for the better. Her Radcliffe project explores how the tools of the digital age could be mobilized to address some of the most pressing socio-environmental challenges of our time, including biodiversity loss, climate change, and water insecurity. Now, here's something fun to know about Karen. Under her pseudonym, Karen Le Billon, she published French Kids Eat Everything, her memoir inspired by a year she spent living in France with her French husband and 2 daughters. This book, which was more widely read than all of her academic work combined, led to a series of TV appearances where Karen greatly surprised her colleagues by appearing under her assumed name. She reassured them by explaining that teaching children to love vegetables is more profoundly impactful for the environment than many academic publications. It is a great pleasure to give the virtual floor to Karen Bakker.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you to everyone at the Radcliffe for fostering an amazing interdisciplinary community this year. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and at that point, I'll really welcome the discussion and the questions. So to begin, the past decade has witnessed an intense debate over the impacts of digital transformation on environmental conservation. You've heard a lot in recent weeks about the power of artificial intelligence to disrupt our economies, our societies, our democracies. My project looks at the potential for AI and digital technologies to disrupt the way that we relate to, regulate, monitor, and govern the environment. Scientists and entrepreneurs, including the biggest tech firms, have spent the past decade assembling an array of satellites and sensors, robots, big data, virtual reality, a whole digital apparatus that seeks to harvest environmental data and automate environmental monitoring and conservation. Proponents promise that these technologies will give rise to something like a digital Green New Deal, which they promise will combat climate change, prevent pollution, and slow biodiversity loss. But critics raise significant concerns about eco-surveillance capitalism and bias. Today, I'll walk you through that debate, which is the focus of my forthcoming book with MIT Press. To provide context, I will briefly give a backgrounder on Gaia theory, for those of you unfamiliar with the concept, as a way of setting the stage for the focus of my research, which is on the digital transformation of Gaia, or wiring Gaia for shorthand. And I'll conclude the presentation with some examples of how these technologies are going to reshape the way we govern the environment in the future. Moreover, how we relate to other species, including expanded notions of multi-species justice. So to begin with Gaia theory. So in a nutshell, Gaia theory holds that living organisms and their environment exist in a mutual interplay of interactions at a planetary scale. The most obvious way we can see this is with biological processes that interrelate with biogeochemical cycles. A familiar example, no doubt, is the oxygen cycle, whereby you and other animals are engaged in exchanging oxygen with the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, of course, that we exhale, absorbed by plants. And this cycle of oxygen and the cycle of carbon, the cycle of nitrogen, there's a lot of interchange of various biochemicals between us and the so-called abiotic or non-living environment. A well-known example I'm sure you're familiar with is the Keeling curve. Of course, emblematic of climate change and increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. But I wanted to show this graphic because I wanted to draw your attention to the smaller curve, the blue curve in the upper left-hand corner. That's the annual variation of CO2 in the planet's atmosphere. And you might be wondering, why isn't it stable? Why does it move up and down every year? Well, the reason is that when vegetation, trees, plants, shrubs, wakes up in the springtime, sort of April, May, and starts to absorb carbon dioxide, that's when we see from the peak of the curve, the descent to late fall, and then we see the CO2 rising again. It's as if on an annual cycle, our planet is inhaling and exhaling carbon dioxide. And that is the beauty of these interrelationships between the atmosphere and living things. Now, we now know that our planet's atmosphere itself and our ability to exist on Earth as oxygen-breathing species is thanks to a simple bacteria, cyanobacteria, that long ago in deep time oxygenated our atmosphere. There's a big debate about the evolution of those interrelationships from that long ago time to the present day, to trees. I won't dive into it except welcome questions about it in the question period, but I did want to flag one scientist that I discuss in the book, Lynn Margulis, who worked not far from here actually at Amherst, who was, in addition to someone who crafted and popularized Gaia theory, she was responsible for the theory of symbiogenesis or endosymbiotic theory. Briefly, symbiogenesis refers to the crucial role of symbiosis in major evolutionary innovations. You might remember from high school biology the fact that you have mitochondria in your cells, and they are the energetic, if you like, counterparts to chloroplasts in plant cells. Chloroplasts, of course, as plants drink sunlight, and chloroplasts assemble the sugars that we then later break down in our mitochondria. And one of the things that had perplexed scientists is that mitochondria do not share our DNA. Mitochondria in your cells are inherited from the maternal line. They do not share your DNA. They're like little aliens living in your bodies, to put it in non-scientific terms. And Lynn Margulis solved this great scientific mystery through her theory of symbiogenesis, controversial at the time, now widely accepted, to explain the origins of eukaryotes, to explain how once upon a time, long ago, our ancestors absorbed other cells and began to collaborate and cooperate with them. The take-home message is that Gaia, you can think of simply as symbiosis observed at a planetary scale, a symbiosis seen from space. And I'll return to this theory of symbiogenesis later in the presentation. This symbiotic set of relationships is now being destabilized by human activity in the current era, the Anthropocene, which is one in which humans have had a significant impact on the planet's climate and its ecosystems. There are a number of, if you like, signatures of this, be they related to nuclear explosions or the large amounts of litter which we strew on the planet. But In brief, the way scientists have documented the Anthropocene is to track those biogeochemical cycles I mentioned earlier. And note the hockey stick curve here, the rapid increase in many of these variables, all of which signal essentially a planetary system that's out of balance, spurring a great debate about whether we are approaching tipping points. We are exceeding planetary boundaries at a global scale. If you were an alien approaching Earth from outer space, one of the first things you would encounter is this. This is a graphic from the European Space Agency. This plots all of the space junk we've put into the upper atmosphere and space surrounding Earth. So we like to think of ourselves as a tool-making species. I sometimes argue that humans are actually a tool-littering species. Over the past century, as the Anthropocene has gained pace, humanity has collectively produced about 50 kilograms of stuff for every square meter of the Earth's surface. That's 30 trillion tons. That technosphere now outweighs the biosphere. And even within the biosphere, we have colonized the land, the oceans, we've dramatically altered ecosystems to the point where we've exterminated or extirpated a large number of species. And one example I like to give is this, that the collective biomass of humans and their livestock now massively outweighs the remaining biomass of wild mammals. So that gives you a sense of the degree to which Gaia and its longstanding biogeochemical interrelationships may be destabilized by human activity. Now, one of the approaches that has been proposed to address this issue is the digital transformation of environmental management at a planetary scale. This is the focus of my forthcoming book with MIT Press. It's the focus of the Radcliffe project, and I've given that project the shorthand, Wiring Gaia. So, of course, the rapid rise of the internet from a few early nodes, including Harvard in 1970 through to today, is remarkable for the fact that the internet is the largest machine that humanity has ever built. And it allows an unprecedented degree of collection and aggregation of data. This is just a map of tweets about sunrise, scrolling across Earth with a beautiful sort of sunburst of tweets as the sunrise scrolls across the Earth. What scientists and entrepreneurs have remarked is that we could be collecting and aggregating similar data about non-humans. And indeed, that is what they are now doing. So sometime over the last 24 hours, just to give you one example, a flock of satellites has flown over your head. That flock of satellites has flown over every single spot on Earth. That group of satellites, which is maintained by a private company called Planet in San Francisco, images the entire Earth's surface, somewhat like a line scanner would image a 2D object, but they're imaging it in 3 dimensions, essentially in real time. And the next step is to create a search engine that doesn't Google text or images, but a search engine that Googles the surface of the Earth in real time. So we have real-time, ubiquitous, continuous environmental data that we can query, that we can analyze. That's just one example of the digital apparatus that's now being constructed to surveil the Earth. That digital apparatus has 3 components: a high degree of instrumentation, so sensors, drones, nanosatellites, cell phone-based interfaces in the oceans and on land. Those devices are interconnected thanks to cloud-based computing, and that enables an exponential increase in data to be collected and shared and distributed. Of course, the data deluge creates an issue. It reverses a prior constraint on 20th century environmental governance, in which we usually had very scarce or patchy data. Now we have a hyperabundance of data, and to analyze that data, scientists are increasingly turning to artificial intelligence, data science, and computational techniques that essentially automate and accelerate data analysis and increasingly make the results available in real time. Now, proponents argue that this is positive for many reasons. There are many examples that they provide, and I'll give some in a moment, about how this accelerates sustainability. It enhances hazard mitigation, and we could incorporate citizens in really new, meaningful, exciting ways in decision making. A lot of that is due to the fact, as this graphic demonstrates on the right, that because we automate the data cycle, collecting, sharing, analyzing, and then real-time distribution, we can overcome another constraint of 20th century environmental governance. When we used to regulate the environment, we were always playing catch up. The post hoc regulation might impose fines or punishments, but the damage was done. You could fine a polluter, but the river was polluted and the fish had died. But now we can detect environmental harm or crime in real time, or even predict it and prevent it. And it's that real-time element that proponents argue is game-changing for the environment. Skeptics, on the other hand, raise concerns about privacy, transparency, and data colonialism. They draw attention to the life cycle of these objects. There's an enormous amount of e-waste at either end of the life cycle, and also human rights abuses associated with some of the elements needed to build these devices. And of course, all of this risks deepening the digital divide. I don't have a lot of time in the presentation to go into depth about the high stakes of this agenda, but I'll give just one example. A few years ago, Microsoft appointed its first chief environmental scientist. Several $100 million were invested in AI for Earth. Google Earth, IBM, Cisco, even DARPA, the Defense Research Agency. This is a major initiative in the US. It's also a major initiative in China, which is arguably the leader in global Earth monitoring technologies. Very apropos, given the balloon incident that we recently had. The nexus between the militarization of conservation and environmental surveillance and environmental governance is thus very much at the heart of the ethics of this debate. And I'll return to that at the end of the presentation. But before I do that, I want to give you some examples, practical examples of what these smart Earth applications are actually like. They're fairly uncanny. They're a little bit like science fiction come to life. Each of these examples highlights a characteristic of smart Earth or digital Earth governance. And the first is that these innovations are ubiquitous. This is Tanya Berger-Wolf. She's at Ohio State. She's a computer scientist. She has invented Wildbook, which is like Facebook for wildlife. Several years ago, she invented essentially a computer vision algorithm analogous to a fingerprint reader or a barcode reader. Her first application, her first use case was zebras. It worked remarkably well, and she has now scaled it up to an algorithm that can identify not only a species, but any individual member of any species if they have any markings, gradations, stripes, spots, scars whatsoever. It's like facial recognition technology for the world's wildlife. So this allows unprecedented wildlife monitoring at scale using drone imagery or satellite imagery. Her work has led to the stabilization and now recovery of one of Africa's most endangered species. And she's now working on reclassifying and analyzing the entire IUCN Red List. And that's the International Union of Conservation's list of the most endangered species, about which, remarkably, we have very little data. We have pretty incomplete censuses of most of the world's endangered wild animals. So the ubiquity of this monitoring is sort of captured in this innovation. A second characteristic of Smart Earth is that it's automated. This is Fei Fang. She's at Carnegie Mellon, also a computer scientist. Her work, which was done in collaboration with Milind Tambe here at Harvard, involved taking an anti-terrorism algorithm first developed for Coast Guard applications and recoding that algorithm to predict the presence and the actual pathways taken by poachers in national parks. So the advantage of this is patrols of gamekeepers or wardens, knowing where the poachers are likely to be, can alter their routes, thus increasing their safety because you have an element of surprise, and also leading to a much greater efficiency at catching poachers. On the very first trial of this, they caught poachers and elephant snares, tiger snares. This has been expanded to several hundred parks around the world. And this application, because it's automated, essentially allows a game-changing reset between the war between poachers and gamekeepers, which poachers had been largely winning. A third aspect of Smart Earth applications, they're mobile. This is one of my favorite examples. These are pop-up wetlands. So let me explain. Cornell University runs a very large crowdsourced digital bird monitoring database. So bird monitoring has taken a real leap forward with digital tech. We can use biologgers on the actual birds' bodies. We can monitor them from satellite. We can monitor them even at night, thanks to these technologies. And we can combine that with actual sightings from citizens of citizen science, and eBird has millions of participants. So we have an unprecedented ability to track bird migrations in real time. Why is that important? It's important because with climate change, those migration patterns are changing. And what used to be predictable is now very unpredictable. So the birds' movements are unpredictable, but what is also unpredictable is the environmental condition of the places where they make stopovers on their long migration routes. A good example is California's Central Valley, which is an important resting site for migratory birds. With climate change, the birds, when they were arriving in the past decade, were not finding the sort of wetland terrain and the food that they needed to continue their journeys. So what Cornell did is partner with the Nature Conservancy and come up with an idea of pop-up wetlands. The way it works is that a precise analysis of the bird migrations is fed into an app. That app has network farmers, and when the birds are coming, the farmers get a text, says something like, "The birds are coming," and then ask them, "Do you want to flood one of your fields or keep one of your fields flooded longer?" for which they are paid. And it's a reverse auction system. The result has been in the Central Valley a significant increase in diversity of shorebirds and waterfowl. And the genius of this idea is if the conditions keep changing, the actual site and the timing of these pop-up wetlands can also change. It can follow the birds. So instead of having one established park, we have these mobile parks that follow the endangered species. A fourth application of Smart Earth is immersive tech. So the AR, VR, MR world, of course, has had a lot of application in gaming, and we've seen a lot of debate about the metaverse. So there are questions about efficacy. But in experiments, Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford has done some interesting experiments. Those who participate in these AR and VR worlds, so for example, there's one VR where you can tour a factory farm. There's another VR where you can actually cut down an old growth tree. Another one of my favorites, puts you in the body of a dragonfly. You're given a backpack with subwoofers. And so when you beat your wings in the VR, you can actually feel your shoulder blades vibrating. So all of these are trying to project us into different relationships with the environment in a virtual fashion. Bailenson's research has shown that these applications work not only to cultivate empathy, but also persistent environmental action well after the VR experience. One of the most widespread applications of this has been, of course, climate flooding. There are many apps now available where you can actually go to a particular site and look through your phone, and the phone will show you what that site will look like once climate change, 30, 40, 50 years, has changed the flooding profile of that particular site. A fifth characteristic of Smart Earth applications is that they are biodigital. And this entails the merging of a few sort of cutting edge scientific agendas, CRISPR and genome editing on the one hand, and bioengineering on the other hand. This is a slug bot. So this particular creature is a sort of hybrid of a 3D printed bioplastic and then cells that are cultivated from the muscles and the neurons of the slug. This will inch forward. And the idea, this is actually work done at Case Western University. This biohybrid creature, will inch forward underwater and could be mounted with environmental sensing devices. And of course, at the end of its lifetime, it will simply decay without leaving any e-waste. This is RoachBot. another approach to biobot technology. This involves essentially affixing electronic sensors to live animals and insects. This has been done with seals for subsurface sea temperature sensing. In this case, the electrodes are inserted through the thorax and connect with the ganglia. So this is a little shocking, but a human operator at a distance can essentially control the movements of this insect. It can actually tell the insect how to move its legs and wings. Similar research has been done with moths, mothbots. So the potential applications here, earthquake recovery, cockroaches can go into very small spaces where no other sort of rescue device can be inserted, and also environmental sensing. So you can already see the sorts of ethical implications that are arising here with these devices. And this debate has intensified with the innovation of xenobots. Actually, one of the key authors of Xenobot being Michael Levin right down the road at Tufts. So Xenobot is the world's first AI-designed biobot. What this team of researchers did is they selected the genome of a frog, the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis. They fed that genome to an AI. They gave the AI instructions about using certain components of the genome to design an organism that would achieve certain tasks. For example, capable of locomotion, capable of self-repair. So after several thousand designs, and I think it took a few months, the AI came up with a design that was created with synthetic biology. This is the world's first example of a living or an entirely biodegradable robot. Living, I should say in scare quotes, because there's some debate about whether it is actually alive, whether it can self-reproduce. So the applications here might include, these are speculative, in nanoscale intelligent drug delivery, scraping plaque out in your arteries, gathering up microplastics in the oceans. It's unclear what applications might be seen once we release this into the wild. And I would add, this is not released into the wild. This is in carefully controlled lab conditions. But my point is that we are at the frontier of biodigital transformation of environmental governance, where a lot of the silicon-based devices we used to use may be replaced by carbon-based, and that will of course accelerate once DNA storage is more widespread. So this fundamentally changes the options we have for a toolkit for environmental conservation, which requires a pretty, I think, fulsome discussion of the ethics. You'll remember I mentioned Lynn Margulis earlier. In the book, I draw on various aspects of social theory to try to query the different approaches that are brought to bear on these innovations. Manuela Veloso, who's one of the leading roboticists and computer scientists, argues in favor of something she calls symbiotic autonomy. So from this perspective, we're facing a future where humans, machines, animals, plants, enter into these cooperative relationships that are mutually enhancing, symbiotic autonomy. Donna Haraway, the well-known social theorist, argues for sympoiesis, a kind of collaborative, generative set of relationships, but one in which the question of autonomy and power relations becomes very central. It's very simplistic, she might argue, to assert that we could have any kind of collaborative relationship with nature, given the sorts of structures of economic appropriation, notably under capitalism, through which we create these creatures. So she would ask us to query the power dynamics that underlie these inventions. Lynn Margulis might offer a slightly different approach. Symbiogenesis, remember, this absorption of other beings to create organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts, she might argue that we're undergoing another phase of symbiogenesis. But this time, humans, rather than simply creating tools and using them, we are now absorbing our own tools. And this is creating a fundamentally different path in evolution. James Lovelock, one of her collaborators, has written his most recent book, he sadly recently passed away, is on what he calls the Novacene, in which he lays out some of these arguments. So for those of you interested in social theory, feel free to ask questions and we can dive deeper in the question period. But I want to move on to one more point about Digital Earth, which is, I think, the most transgressive and potentially the most interesting. And that is the potential for smart Earth applications to extend participation in environmental governance to non-humans. That is, it would no longer be solely humans who heuristically assume that we are the ones who govern the planet. And I've developed this argument initially in an earlier book that was just published in October, The Sounds of Life. And I'll just walk you briefly through the arguments as one example of this interspecies interrelationship. So The Sounds of Life focuses on one aspect of smart Earth technology, and that is digital bioacoustics and ecoacoustics. These are digital bioacoustics recorders. They're very simple devices. They can record large data sets of sound, often well beyond human hearing range in the high ultrasound or the low infrasound, higher or lower than our hearing range. That data can be encoded into spectrograms. This is a spectrogram of a rainforest. Bernie Krause, some of his work led to the insight that this spectrogram shows us sort of a principle in nature, the acoustic niche hypothesis, which is that species share acoustic space, but they don't compete. It's a bit like distributing radio stations on a radio dial. You can see the different species here are essentially communicating at different frequencies at different times. A trained ecoacoustician could look at this spectrogram, and much like a trained radiologist could decode an X-ray or an MRI, they could decode this spectrogram and tell you something about the biodiversity of this ecosystem. We can also track the evolution of these spectrograms over time. They are excellent and very low-cost automated ways to track species richness for vocally active species. A darker blank spectrogram is actually one that indicates a less biodiverse environment. And indeed, these are more widely used now for environmental conservation and monitoring purposes than in the past. Another application scientists are developing seeks to build on this knowledge and engage in interspecies communication. Essentially, the proposal here is much like the Google Translate in your phone, powered by machine learning. The proposal is that we could begin to detect patterns in non-human communication and translate between human languages and the communicative regimes of other species. So much like the Rosetta Stone, this archaeological artifact that enabled translation between known languages and at the time unknown, Egyptian hieroglyphics revealed a lot about ancient Egyptian civilization. The proposal is one could do the same with non-human communication. And in fact, the SETI project, the Citation Translation Initiative, spun out of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, David Groover, a couple of years ago. They are working on decoding sperm whale communication. The Earth Species Project is another initiative, and a variety of other initiatives have sprung up. For example, the Elephant Dictionary Initiative, Joyce Poole in East Africa. So these scientific agendas are attracting interest from entrepreneurs. So raising a lot of ethical questions about whether we could indeed engage in interspecies communication and what the ethics might be of doing so. This is very, very complicated. I'm just going to give you one example. Honeybee language, honeybee communication, which has been well known for millennia, was something that was intensively studied by Carl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in the mid-20th century. He identified the now well-known waggle dance, this figure of 8 dance, very complex, which enables bees to communicate the distance and direction of a nectar source to their hive mates, even if the nectar source is very far away, over a lake, behind a mountain. Pretty amazing communication skills. We've deepened our knowledge of honeybee communication with digital technologies using computer vision as well as acoustics, because honeybee language is vibrational, positional, spatial. Honeybees can sense the position of polarized light. They orient their bodies to the position of the sun. They rotate their abdomens with 6 degrees of freedom. Amazing. But try and imagine translating this in some meaningful way. I just play one audio clip. So there are researchers that are actually trying to do this. Tim Landgraf in Berlin has actually used computer vision to track honeybee movement, encoded this information combined with acoustics into honeybee robots. I'll just play you a video. This is a honeybee robot trying to do a waggle dance in a beehive. Largely, this doesn't work. The bees often attack this robot. They certainly don't welcome it, but Landgraf's lab has actually had one result where the waggle dance communicated location information to honeybees. He didn't know why it worked that one time, doesn't know how to replicate it, but that gives you a sense of where we're at in this field, essentially developing what are actually technically complex, but still very clumsy playback experiments. And with those playback experiments, we actually have determined that a number of different species have specific signals that mean specific things. They have individual names, bats, dolphins. They can convey very complex ecological information, not only between animals, but also between animals and plants. So there's a huge field of communication out there that we can indeed sense with digital tech. And perhaps one day we will break the interspecies communication barrier. So I'll conclude with a very brief description of environmental futures. And I will actually just use this to open up the discussion period because it highlights some of the directions in which this conservation work is going. So one of the biggest initiatives to date with Smart Earth Tech has been to wire up the oceans. Digital instrumentation, one example is the Smart Ocean System off of the Pacific Northwest coast. So along with the instrumentation comes drones. This is a COTSbot. It's an underwater autonomous vehicle. It programs the Great Barrier Reef. It uses computer vision to identify an invasive species, crown of thorns starfish, that is incredibly disruptive to reef life. And you can see it extending its metal arm here and killing the starfish by lethal injection. So this is actually operational. These are the sorts of devices that are now patrolling the oceans. So within this field, this digital field, which raises lots of questions about the ethics of conservation, one application is mobile protected areas. Remember, I said earlier that we were going to have more mobile conservation. Indeed, this is occurring in the oceans. So the idea here is pretty simple. You put biologgers on species and you also use underwater digital acoustics to listen and identify their location. This is very computationally intensive because you're tracking many things to help predict where the animals not only are, but where they're going to be. So sea surface temperature, weather, etc. What that translates into is like weather maps for species. This is being done with endangered tuna off the Australian coast. It's being done with turtles in Hawaii, and it's been done with whales off both coasts of the US, in fact, off the coast right here in Boston. This is a whale map. It's an aggregate of whale sightings. I took this just this past weekend. The whales have moved further south. In the winter, they would move further north in the summer. This map and the data is distributed to ship's captains with high degree of geographical accuracy in real time. And what that allows regulators to do is require that ship's captains and fishers move out of the way, slow down, or stop fishing in areas where whales have been sighted. The most stringent regulation is actually on the Canadian side of the border to protect very endangered North Atlantic right whales, many of which moved out of the Gulf of Maine in search of food. Given changing ocean conditions under climate change, a lot of species are migrating north, right whales included. So this regulatory regime is monitoring whale movements in real time, conveying that information to those on boats in the ocean in real time, and requiring them to get out of the whale's way. The highest fine that could be administered is $250,000 on the Canadian side. So imagine this. You have a population of less than 400 whales, the North Atlantic right whale, that is left after industrial whaling. Only a few decades ago, we were harpooning them. On the West Coast, we were machine gunning some whales. And yet today, we have this digital apparatus that is giving agency to the whales. That is a population of less than 400 whales, simply by singing, can control the movements of tens of thousands of ships along a coast that's home to hundreds of millions of people. So I'm not suggesting that this will in any way be sufficient to save this population. It certainly is an important factor. But I want to leave you with this thought about the future potential of environmental regulation to entail some form of collaboration with non-humans enabled through digital technology. Essentially, we now have whale lanes in the ocean alongside shipping lanes. Could you scale this up to the global oceans? Scientists are now proposing exactly that. So I will close by mentioning I'd welcome questions about critiques. There are many. The data critiques alone are a whole chapter in the book. There are many regulatory and legal issues that are analogous to those that pertain to digital surveillance of humans. There's an extra complication with Indigenous data sovereignty, and that pertains to the important fact that Indigenous communities control many of these territories. They do also often have a fiduciary or stewardship responsibility for territories with high levels of biodiversity. And so Indigenous data sovereignty comes into play in these debates in a very important way. Many of the critiques that I am engaging with in the project in the book are also something that's not really front and center for the innovators pushing these innovations forward. I mentioned environmental impacts earlier. We're adding to the technosphere with all of these devices, and we don't have a good plan to clean it up. And we are potentially exacerbating the digital divide, particularly when these devices and regulatory regimes are applied in contexts of power imbalances, of areas of aggressive conservation management. And so the risk is we're sort of automating inequality rather than democratizing access to digital environmental data and digital decision-making. So I'll welcome your questions on some of the ethical challenges. I'll leave you with a question. Do you believe that techno-nature can substitute for the real thing? And with that, I'll welcome our discussion and turn it back over to Claudia.
Wow, totally fascinating. We have a few questions that are, I'm sure that our audience have more, so feel free to put them in Slido. Let me go to one that kind of seems to hit at the core of your talk. Is a wired Gaia a desirable outcome or a trade-off to keep our lifestyle? Though humans are reliant on machines and tools, couldn't we use less of them?
Yes, excellent question. In fact, wiring Gaia may be mistaking the disease for the cure. It may be entirely misguided to seek to apply more technology to solve a problem that's essentially caused by too much technology. And the thought of a future where the entire planet and the global oceans are littered with digital environmental monitoring devices is not a pleasant one. I think I argue in the book, there's sort of a happy medium. I argue very specifically that there are certain cases, notably the most endangered species, which are subject in some cases to significant environmental crimes that are currently not monitored, and or if they are, they're not the regulations are not enforced. For those, if you like, triage cases where digital tech can help, I think we should be doing that. I think digital tech can also be used for environmental regeneration. I didn't have a chance to get into it in the presentation, but digital bioacoustics has been demonstrated by Steve Simpson and Tim Gordon and others to be really effective at helping to regenerate coral reefs. It turns out because coral are attuned to sound, notably coral larvae and fish larvae, if you play the sounds of a healthy reef, coral reef DJ, I know this sounds like science fiction, but it's actually science, to degraded coral reefs, you help with coral reef restoration. So in these sorts of test cases, I think this is really, really helpful. What I think is worrisome is the privatization of the world's environmental data. The United Nations Environment Program is trying to stand up a sort of collaborative repository for environmental data as a digital commons. It's unclear whether that will actually work. In the meantime, much of that data is being privatized. So not only is the worry about essentially an over-application of this technological assemblage, but there's another worry about the privatization of environmental data, much of which has value we probably haven't figured out yet. And for that reason, I think it would actually be helpful for nation states, for governments to update their environmental governance regulations, their environmental laws, which essentially mostly date in spirit from the 1970s and 80s, to get ahead of this digital earth agenda, because right now it's essentially private companies that are leading.
Right. The next question goes kind of to the CO2 levels. What digital technology projects are happening regarding CO2 levels, and what possibilities for the future do you see in this work?
Oh, great. I'm going to scale it out slightly to greenhouse gas emissions. So one interesting project, it's a set of projects, entails real-time monitoring of methane emissions by satellite. The Environmental Defense Fund, I think collaborating with people at Harvard, is launching their own satellite. So imagine this, an environmental NGO launching their own satellite. A company in Canada has also launched one already, GHGSat. And these satellites have incredibly fine-grained ability to detect methane plumes in real time. So, for example, the largest methane plume in Europe was recently discovered coming from a garbage dump near Madrid. The Spanish government was shocked and embarrassed, right? So methane, of course, being an exceptionally aggressive contributor to climate change, we now have the ability to name and shame the top methane emitters in real time globally, and some jurisdictions like California are talking about taking the next step and issuing fines in real time, or more complex auction mechanisms that would essentially be very similar to what was used to reduce acid rain. If you remember, in the 80s and 90s, acid rain was a big deal. So the analogy would be that when that acid rain work was done, a lot of the data got sent back and forth by fax, believe it or not. But now we have the ability to automate that regulatory regime in real time. And with sticks and carrots, that can actually have a very significant impact on the most egregious emitters and polluters. So there is also other work that's being done more long-term that would optimize energy grids using artificial intelligence. So as a species, we're very wasteful. There's a lot of efficiency gains that are possible, both within the digital network, server farms, etc., which are incredibly energy intensive, but also just more generally energy distribution, transmission. So notwithstanding those gains, it is the best calculations suggest that as we bring more and more people online globally, as we intensify our use of digital data, probably the net production of greenhouse gas emissions by the digital sector, tech plus all the digital devices, will exceed any gains that we would be likely to make through these technologies. So there is a huge issue for the tech sector to face up to is if the internet were a country, it would be the third largest emitter, I think, in the world after India and China, the US and China, sorry. And so the tech sector is a huge issue to face up to. So on the one hand, there are these great innovations we're creating. On the other hand, they themselves have a huge climate problem.
Right. Okay, let's go back to wetlands. Creating pop-up wetlands seems great for complementing Gaia's functioning, but organic AI is organic AI likely to interfere with natural systems? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so we don't have organic AI yet. So there are some, like Lucas Joppa, who's the chief environmental scientist at Microsoft, that talks about building a planetary computer powered by AI. So this AI, because in theory it would have so much Earth data, environmental data at its disposal, it could track these biogeochemical flows and these flows and movements of organisms in real time, and it could intervene. This is sounding very much like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, I know. So first of all, we're not there yet. We're very far from that. And of course, nature always surprises us with interconnections and interrelationships we don't know about. So I don't believe that, if you like, the strong case for organic AI is anywhere close. And I actually feel like that probably wouldn't be a wise idea, according to most ecologists, because of the if you like, the unforeseen implications of essentially what would be large-scale natural laboratory experiments with whole species. Now, a smaller version, however, could actually potentially be useful in constrained ecosystems with constrained species which are highly endangered. So essentially, I wouldn't want to let these applications loose in the wild. Whoever asked the question, though, it's a very good question, and I hope they follow up with me after the talk to chat a bit more, because there's another interpretation of organic AI that we could also chat about.
Wonderful. The next question, will smart Earth technologies move us forward in granting legal protection to the other parties or other species involved in these technologies?
So, I mean, I think a simple way to phrase it is smart Earth technologies make it technically possible to enable forms of legal personhood that were formerly not available to us, technically. Whether or not we grant those to non-humans and extend the political franchise or the economic franchise is, of course, a political discussion. But we now have the ability, for example, to use blockchain to create property rights. We have the ability through digital acoustics to listen for species and to essentially constrain human movements through the oceans, and essentially have co-participation in environmental governance through sharing the jurisdiction over ocean space. Now, whether this actually ends up with the meaningful granting of rights, environmental rights to non-humans, I don't think we will achieve through these mechanisms, because these mechanisms are ultimately still they would be not participating on a level playing field on a human created system of property ownership and economic relations. So something more significant, something more transformative might transpire. In the book, I talk briefly about the work of Isabelle Stengers and Bruno Latour on what they call cosmopolitics, or the parliament of things. What one could imagine as a thought experiment, a parliament of earthlings, with a greater degree of political voice and agency, which I don't think have invented yet, but perhaps these technologies could open the door to something like a parliament of earthlings.
Right. And following up exactly on what you're saying, the next question we asked, what sorts of international or global forums have the capacity to discuss these issues and act or enforce any conclusions? Are there any?
Yeah, so UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, the Coalition on Digital Environmental Sustainability, the German Environment Agency, WBGU, did a great report on digital sustainability. And when the Germans had the presidency of the EU, they were looking at the intersection of digital transformation and environmental sustainability. So those are some of the agencies that are examining this, but under significant constraints. I mean, it would be great to see something like Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, for any of you who've read that science fiction novel, come to life and have something like this under its remit. But again, our environmental governance architecture essentially dates from the 1970s and 80s in a pre-digital age. And what we actually need is an overhaul at the national and international level to begin to implement some of these in a systematic way. Otherwise, we'll just get piecemeal innovation. Like we might eventually see the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea incorporate, mobile protected areas that are digitally enabled. That could take years. So there is a sort of Earth system governance question here, and this has become a sort of interesting field in academic research. There's a new journal, Earth System Governance, and so that's where some of these debates are playing out. But I don't think we have that architecture yet.
So you touched on native communities in your talk, and one of the questions asked, are there promising economic opportunities to engage minority communities in this kind of work, I guess, yeah?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a Canadian example. And I want to ground this, first of all, not being Indigenous, but acknowledging there's important work being done on Indigenous data sovereignty. Stephanie Caro Russell, for example, Tahu Kukutai, who's written a book on Indigenous data sovereignty in New Zealand. So this, I would really recommend people go and engage with that literature. But what it asserts is it's not that we would use the verb engage, rather that sovereignty and Indigenous law predates in Canada, colonialism, and that those natural law founded relationships on Indigenous territories, keeping in mind Canada has a system of legal pluralism, where on Canadian territory we have the civil law, common law, and Indigenous law, all are operative, all are legal. That we have a set of initiatives by Indigenous communities, which they are leading, which they have generated, for example, Indigenous guardian networks along the coastlines and across large swathes of Northern Canada, where Indigenous communities are the majority. So in that context, what I would say is that it's not about engaging, it's rather informing ourselves about the leadership that Indigenous communities have shown in digital innovation, in lands management, and in conserving biodiversity. And that actually we have to play catch up, because there's sort of a bit of amnesia about Indigenous sovereignty, and also about the innovation that's happening in those communities. And there's some very interesting work being done at the UN level to share those initiatives more broadly internationally.
Right. There is a question about about the tension between the collection and use of open data for good purposes, and the tension with, the poachers and, people who are not as well intended. And, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the internet mantra is data wants to be free, right? But with freely available data, one can use a lot of that data for nefarious ends. Precision fishing, precision hunting. Poachers could use this data. In fact, some of the tigers that have been outfitted with radio collars, poachers have hacked into those systems and used it to track down the tigers. It actually just helps them poach more efficiently. So it's like a digital arms race between poachers turned hackers and wardens in parks. So these are tricky debates, but I think one insight again from Indigenous data sovereignty is we shouldn't assume that this data is free. It belongs to someone. So if we assume that non-humans have personhood, then perhaps non-humans own their own data. We have not asked consent. They have not given it. Indigenous communities have a claim to the environmental data harvested from their territories. That would only be shared with certain protocols. So my sense is that the open data regime would eventually crumble from too many bad actors, but we have an alternative architecture to look to. There's some great work being done by groups like Anamiki River that are creating alternative data platforms with varying protocols and levels of access. And as much as I appreciate the importance of ecological data sharing, I think raw data sharing in real time is probably not the way to go. And these alternative protocols would contain the kind of safeguards rooted in respect for land and place that we would need to see to try and ensure that this data is not misused. It may also be that we decide there are data-free territories, that there are territories about which we do not gather any data, much like territories today which are wilderness areas in which human presence is not supposed to be. So maybe we don't need to collect data about all of the Earth's surface. Again, a good debate, not a decided debate.
Right. I want to ask this question. We have 1 minute for a question and for the answer. This is fascinating work and would lend itself to wonderful exhibitions in museums. Do you know any that have happened or are being created?
Yeah, together with Max Ritz, who's my brilliant collaborator now at Clark, we've written an article on Anthropocene festivals. There's a lot of interesting work that's going on at the confluence of sort of digital tech art and museum studies. And so that is an academic publication, which is open source. So I'd encourage people to go look at that. We have a number of examples of different communities and exhibitions that they could engage with if that's of interest.
Wonderful. That's a great note to end our conversation today. Thank you, Karen, for your amazing presentation and perspectives. I also want to thank our audience for your terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. That's all from us today. Thank you and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.